All right. Well, we're going to continue our series in the book of Revelation. If you'd like to turn with me to Revelation chapter 12, that's where we're going to be this evening. And the last couple of weeks, we've been working through the 7 trumpet judgments, if you will recall. And these 7 trumpet judgments are either a recap of the 7 seals, where we are going to be seeing the same events from a different perspective, and that view is known as recapitulation. And or, as we've been seeing these new 7 trumpet judgments, they are what is known as a chronological progression, which is coming out of the 7th and final seal. So there are some different views on where these 7 trumpet judgments align when it comes to the timeline of history. And we've been working through the trumpet judgments, and we got to the 6th trumpet judgment in chapter 9. And then in chapter 10, we got into an interlude where the narrative did not move forward, and we were getting some new symbols and new characters were being introduced. And we saw that there was this mighty angel that came down with a little book, and that John gets this book and he eats it, and it's bittersweet. And then after that, we were introduced into the 2 witnesses and how they have this ministry for a certain amount of time, and how they are killed by this beast that comes. And then the witnesses that are dead, they rise from the dead, and then they ascend to heaven, and it brings fear on the earth, or fear for the people that are witnessing this. And then we're reintroduced at the end of chapter 11 with the 7th trumpet. So we see the final trumpet sound, and then it makes this bold announcement about how the kingdoms of the world are becoming the kingdom of Christ, and how Christ's victory is imminent at this point. And so then we would think that the whole book would be summarized right here at the end here, where we're going to see the Christ return and victory is won, and basically the book ends. But we see instead there's a new interlude here in chapter 12. And so like before in chapter 10 and chapter 11, we're not moving forward in the narrative. What we're going to be seeing once again is a description of something that is a spiritual truth. And we're going to be introduced to a few new characters tonight. We're going to be seeing a woman who is pregnant. We're going to be seeing a child. And we're going to be seeing a dragon described tonight. So if you haven't already, we're going to be in Revelation chapter 12. And I'll read that for us this evening. Now a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven, and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, who is ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, "Now salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time." Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So, right here we see in chapter 12 that, as I mentioned, there are these three main characters that we're going to see and talk about in this chapter. We see the woman, we see the dragon, and we see this child. And in verses 1 to 6, it starts to give us a little bit of detail about what these or who these characters represent. And what's interesting is we've looked at some other symbols and different characters in the book so far. You normally see there's going to be different perspectives that are listed, and they usually have their own kind of understanding about this. Well, for these three characters, for the most part, there's a large agreement or a great agreement on them. The only one that really has significant difference would be maybe the woman. So what do these individuals represent? Well, we have the woman, who we're introduced to in verse 1. And the primary two views for the woman is that she either represents Israel or she represents the church, or there might be a nuanced position in which they may have some type of blending of the two, or they might describe it slightly in a different way. But typically they're going to say it's either the faithful remnant of Israel, it's the ethnic Israel, or it's going to be the spiritual Israel, which is the church. And so that's what they would say when we see this woman described in this account. So we see this woman, she is pregnant, she has these birth pains, and she's about to give birth to the child, and there's this dragon that's described in these different ways, and he's basically waiting to devour and kill the child. But she has the child doesn't get killed. It says that actually that the child is born, and then it says ascends to heaven. And then from there is described this war in heaven in verses 7 to 12. And then in verses 13 to 17, we see how when the dragon loses the war in heaven, he's cast to the earth, and there he starts to war and chase after the woman, and then her other offspring after that. So who is this woman then? Is it Israel or is it the church? Well, the arguments for Israel is those who would point to the fact that how it describes the woman. It says that she has the sun, she is clothed with the sun, and it says that the moon is under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. So we see the sun, we see the moon, we see 12 stars mentioned. The other place where that all of that is mentioned within the same context is Genesis 37, verses 6 to 11. And what this describes is Joseph's dream, actually, that he gives and interprets to his family. I'll read that for us. It says, "So he said to them, 'Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed, your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind." So what this seems to potentially be referencing in Revelation is how the sun represents Jacob or Israel, how the moon is his wife, and then how the children are these stars, and Joseph would be then that final star. You have the 11 and then himself. So you would have the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars, and that would seem to represent the family or the people of Israel. Those who hold that this also represents Israel would point out that the labor pains very well could represent how there was constant afflictions being going against the people, that Israel was constantly enduring this persecution as they were awaiting the coming Messiah. So as we look throughout the Old Testament, all of these different things that they're experiencing as they're hoping and praying for the king to come. So they would say this is what's happening before the child is born, before Jesus comes. They would say that this is them waiting for the Messiah. And then for the church perspective, what they would point out is they would allude to the fact that there are other instances in the New Testament as well as in Revelation that may give incentive to think that the church, being the spiritual Israel, is what's being the true Israel or the faithful Israel. And then what they would say is what the church is pregnant with in this is pregnant with the promises of Christ. And so as the church has been given the messianic promises, all these things that we are promised for his return, this is what we are waiting for, and it comes through birth and realization through Christ whenever Christ is fulfilled. So there's some points where we could see it applying either to Israel or the church. And then verse 6, we see that the woman she flees into the wilderness, and then she is fed for 1,260 days, or 1,260 days. And that term has been referenced last week, if you remember. We talked a little bit about it. So we have the 1,260 days, which is a length of time, but there are different references of the same amount of time that is used throughout Revelation as well as in Daniel. So you have the 1,260 days, or it might be called the 42 months, or 3.5 years. All of these are basically the same time period that they're covering. We'll also see at the end of this chapter this evening that there's also a way of phrasing it this way. Time, times, and half a time, which that's supposed to be a year, 2 years, and then a half a year. So all of these are basically the same amount of time. They're using different words or different language to describe the same period of time. And this period of time in chapter 11 was talking about the amount of time that the two witnesses, would be doing their ministry. And then in this chapter, we see that this same amount of time is how long the woman is in the wilderness and is being fed and protected by God. And I pointed earlier or last week to the fact that this same time frame is mentioned in Daniel chapter 7 regarding his 70th week, which that is where there's this discussion about how these events are going to unfold throughout history and how there's this final week that may still have to unfold depending on your view of eschatology, your view of the book of Revelation. But we see that this period of time, this woman is in the wilderness. So we have her in the wilderness, and we see that she could either be Israel or the church. Then we have the dragon. And as I said, there's a little bit of debate on who this is for the woman.
I have a question.
Sure.
Verse 5, it says, she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Well, Psalms 2:9, that male child ruled with a rod of iron is Jesus.
Yeah, and we'll get to the child.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we haven't got there. We just did the woman. Yeah. So we have the woman here, Then we have the dragon, and really, like I said, there's no debate here on who the dragon represents. The dragon in verse 9 is clearly identified, and it says, "So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." So we see that this chapter clearly, it doesn't make you have to guess or figure out or try to. It says it very clearly. The dragon is Satan in this chapter, and it gives a little bit more information too. It says that it's the serpent of old, which gives us a basis for understanding that in Genesis, that's the same character, because it actually, if you might not have known this, Genesis never actually says the serpent or the snake is the devil, or never says it's Satan. And actually, the term Satan and the devil are actually not even real names. They are actually titles and adjectives of the description of the person, because Satan means to be the adversary, and the devil actually means to be like the accuser or the slanderer. So these are actually titles given for this individual that has been going out throughout Scripture as we see him going in and out of different storylines. So we see that the dragon here it represents Satan, and Satan is described as having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head, or on his heads, and that's seen in verse 3. Now, we've talked about the number 7 before, how 7 can be symbolic for having a completeness or perfection or something of that nature, and so some have thought maybe this is describing how the devil, as being the god of the age, will have or does possess basically a great amount of control or a complete amount of power on this earth. And that he, with the diadems, that's crowns, and so he also has power within government and civil authorities and things like that. Others think that this may be describing specific kingdoms that will exist maybe in the future, where it might be talking about, I think the 10 horns, I think it talks about a little bit later. We'll look at this next week with the beast, because you're going to see some similar descriptions of the beast that has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. But there's talking about maybe it describes a certain amount of hills and a certain amount of kings that are present on these locations. But we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. But it seems to give some information about his power and how he does have some type of rule or reign on the earth. We then see in verse 4 that it says that his tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Now, some of you guys have probably heard that before, or maybe if you've ever heard the statement, well, Satan and 1/3 of the angels, they all fell, right? They fell from heaven whenever Satan rebelled. That's where they usually will get that thought from. And so if you hold that view and you say that is what this is describing, you would also maybe supplement it with Jude verse 6, where it says, "And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day." So Jude 6 kind of just also indicating that there are angels that did rebel like Satan, and that their destiny is eventually going to be punishment for them. So many will think that what's being described here is Satan when he was flying up. He's going down from heaven, and he takes with him 1/3 of the stars, which mentioned earlier in Revelation, stars were representing angels or angelic beings. However, some of you may have heard that view, but may have never heard that there are actually some other views for this verse here, to where it might not be that 1/3 of the angels actually fell. Some say that this actually is just a symbolic representation of just saying how powerful the dragon is, right? Because Satan isn't actually a dragon, right? He's symbolically being represented as a dragon. So some say it could be pointing to the fact that he's so powerful that he could literally grab 1/3 of the stars of the universe and basically throw them to the earth. And they're saying that this is just describing the power, just like the 7 heads and the 10 horns and the diadems, just describing how powerful the force is of Satan. And then there's one other view that takes the third of the stars of heaven as being described as some type of taking control of a third of the powers of the world, and saying that the stars are representing these political, military leaders on the earth. So that's something for maybe to look through, chew on a little bit, think about how there are some different perspectives on that, but it does describe him as this dragon and a third of the stars of heaven being thrown to the earth. We then see in verse 4 that he has a mission, right? So not only is he powerful, does he have these different descriptions of himself, but he has a mission, and his mission is to devour and to destroy this child that the woman is pregnant with. And as it was already mentioned, so the child clearly represents Christ here. Because we see in verse 5 how it talks about a male child being born, and then what his purpose is to rule the nations with a rod of iron. And it was even already mentioned that this is quoting Psalm 2, verses 7 to 9, where it says, "I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations of your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel.'" So this is describing a messianic psalm that is pointing to the fact that this child being born is going to be the one who is going to be the king of all nations. He's going to be the one who's going to shepherd, and he is going to be the one who rules all of the earth. But what we also see in verse 5 is not only is this child born, and it says that he's going to be one who will rule, but then it says in the exact same verse, "And the child was caught up to God in his throne." So what we actually see here, this is Christ being described, but within one verse, it's describing his birth, and then it skips all the way to the end of his life to his ascension. So in one verse, we're literally skipping 33 years, right? So he's born. It says that the dragon's there wanting to kill him and devour him. However, we see instead he escapes the clutches of the dragon and he ascends, and which is pointing to the fact that now Christ is at the right hand. He is enthroned. He is the king in heaven. And that's what's pointing us back to the Lamb that was in the heavenly throne room in chapters 4 and 5. But I think this is also telling of when we look at the events described in the Old Testament leading up to the birth of Christ, how we have seen this dragon constantly trying to war against the woman and the child. Because if you just think about the birth of Christ, there was an individual who commanded a murder of the innocents. If you would remember that many of the children were being killed at the time of Christ's birth, because they were trying to kill Jesus. And so what this actually shows is this was actually being inspired satanically, that the dragon was behind this whole thing. And so when we look all the way back from the garden, where it talks about the woman's seed, and it talks about how it will crush the serpent's head. So we see this whole storyline of how Israel and how the dragon has come to try to destroy the people and destroy the seed. And then we see how at the crucifixion, we think once again that maybe the dragon is finally won by killing the child, but we obviously know the story of the gospel that he died, but he rose again, and then he ascends. And so now the dragon, we see, fails every single time. It fails at the beginning in the garden, it fails with the birth, it fails in the ministry and life, and it fails at the crucifixion, and now he has ascended to the throne. Well, that's what kind of leads then into the second section in verses 7 to 12, where we see this war described in heaven. And we see a cosmic spiritual battle described between Michael, the archangel, and Satan and his angels. And there's a little bit of debate here regarding when this fall took place. And just a reminder, have it up there on the slide for you if you'd like to look at it. We have these different perspectives, right? We have the idealist, we have the preterist, and we have the futurist. And some of that might warrant a little bit of how you understand when and where this war in heaven takes place. So the idealist we see right here, it's prophecies that are fulfilled recurrently throughout history, so they're not looking for Revelation to describe just at the very beginning or at 80, 70 or in the future. They're saying you're going to see all of these prophecies recurrently occur throughout history. The preterists, they're going to say what we're seeing being described in these events are happening around the time of AD 70, but they've been fulfilled primarily all in the past. And then the futurist is going to say most of these prophecies are still to be fulfilled in the future. So with that in mind, as we think about these events of the war in heaven being described, where we have Satan coming, trying to accuse those who were in heaven, the saints that are covered by the blood of the Lamb. We see that Michael and them and the angels, they war against Satan, and they cast him out. They throw him down and his angels. There's some that look at the war in heaven, and what they say here is that it's not meant to be the next order in the timeline of chapter 12, where we saw verses 1 to 6, how we see it describing how Christ ascends, and then there's some that will say, and then the dragon ascends. What some will say is, no, this is describing Satan's fall at the very beginning of history. They would say that this is alluding to what Isaiah and Ezekiel may refer to, Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, where it talks about maybe the fall of Satan, where he was wanting to be like God. He was wanting to be worshipped, and then he basically tried to seize power, and so then he was cast out of heaven. Some think maybe that is what's being described here. Others would say that what happened in the war in heaven here is actually the events surrounding the crucifixion. So what they're saying, this war in heaven is actually all of what's going on supernaturally and spiritually when Jesus is being crucified to the cross. In Colossians chapter 2, verses 4 to 15, it says, 14 to 15, it says, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. So there are some, this is going to primarily be the preterist view. The preterist would say that this war is the cross. So when Jesus died on the cross, he completely defeated Satan, and he cast him from heaven at that point. Then there are those who are going to be more of the futurist perspective, though this could be an idealist perspective as well, say that this is going to be sometime in the future tribulation period, where Satan will go to heaven, he will try to continue to accuse the brethren, and finally God will have Michael and the angels cast him out, where he will no longer be allowed to be in heaven. But that may make you think about this a little bit. So wait, how is Satan going to heaven, right? Maybe you've never thought of it that way. Maybe you've thought Satan's always not been in heaven, right? Because whenever he fell, he was cast out of heaven. However, in Job chapter 1 and 2, we see actually that Hasatan, the Satan, was present in the council room of God, where he was actually going and he was accusing, being the accuser that he was accusing Job and saying that he was basically playing the system. So we see that actually Satan has had access to give reports to God when God allows him to come to some aspect of his presence to speak to the Lord or give an account or accuse the brethren in some sense. So it seems to be, at least in some capacity, Satan is allowed to approach God in certain circumstances or conditions. Well, whatever your view is, we see that there is a description where there's this conflict in heaven, where at some point in history, whether it is his fall, which I think is probably less likely for this specific instance, but it's still an option on the table. We do see that there are events that happen in history where Satan can come to heaven, but if it's either at the cross or sometime in the future where he will no longer be able to be in heaven. So there are some that say that no, Satan can't go to heaven anymore, and there are some that say he still has access until the very end, where right before Christ's return, where the tribulation occurs. They would say that finally it ceased. And then it says, and the reason for it being that is because he no longer has a basis for an accusation because they have been cleansed by the Lamb's blood, it says. And so they celebrate in heaven at the end of verses 11 and 12 there. And then we see in verses 13 to 17, because Satan has lost the battle in heaven, and because Christ has won and he's on the throne now, he's thrown down to the earth, and he's basically furious. And so what he does, knowing he only has a short amount of time, what he does is he starts to war against the woman, right? The woman that we already saw described. And he basically starts to just go right after her. He starts to seek her out, trying to destroy her. And it describes some different ways that he tries to do it. And it uses the imagery of using flood waters out of his mouth. And some have disagreed on whether that's an actual flood. Maybe Satan's using actual supernatural powers to affect the climate and the weather. Or maybe it's meant to use some type of false doctrine and deceiving, or maybe he's using political and military armies to seize and to capture and to kill the woman. But God, what he does in that 1,260 days, or the times and a half time, we see that she is actually going to be protected. So though there's going to be persecution, the dragon's going to pursue her, God's going to protect the woman for a significant amount of time. And then because of that, and the dragon knowing his time is limited, he then goes, it says, after the woman's other offspring. So the woman's other offspring, which makes you think, okay, so we have the woman, we have the dragon, we have the child, but who are the other offspring? Well, that's going to kind of go back to kind of your understanding of the woman, and also your view of the idealist, the preterist, or the futurist. So, what some idealists would say is that what we're seeing here described is this is Satan persecuting the church throughout the church age, and at some point, Satan is going to realize that he will not be able to conquer the church and get rid of the church as a whole, so what he's going to do is just start trying to pluck out individuals. And so the other offspring are just those who are individual Christians, and he's trying to just pluck out one at a time and take as many as he basically can. That's how an idealist may understand the other offspring, as individual Christians. A preterist would say that what is being described here in the fleeing of the woman to the wilderness and the dragon then going after the other offspring, they would say that this is describing how the Jewish Christians in AD 70 fled Jerusalem before the siege that happened at Jerusalem and at the destruction of the temple, and how God protected those Jewish Christians in the wilderness. And then now Satan, because he couldn't get those individuals, he's now seeking to vent his wrath on the rest or the other flock, which is the church. So these are like the Gentile Christians. And though he knows his time is limited, he's now pursuing, ever since that time, going after the Gentile Christians. And then the futurist would say that this is describing how God is protecting believing Jews from Satan in the future time, and this will lead to him to persecute the church whenever God protects the nation of Israel. So Satan is trying to destroy, completely wipe out Israel, and for some reason he realizes that he can't do it, and so then what he does is he allows the intensified persecution at the end times to be focused solely on the church. So there are some different ways of understanding that persecution and protection. So, with that being said, I'm going to just give you 3 points of application tonight, because as I normally do, there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of different perspectives here. I like to always give you at least some tangible things that you can say, this is what, no matter what our perspective is, we can take this to heart as a Christian, we can apply it to our lives. The first one is that though Satan may appear in control at times, we need to always remember that Jesus is the king. Jesus is king, because what we see in this chapter is it describes Satan as this fiery red dragon, 7 heads, all these horns, these crowns, and it describes Jesus as a child and he's with his pregnant mom, right? Like that's kind of the symbolism that we see here. But then what we reveal throughout this is how the devil loses every time. How he, the child, grows up, he ascends, and he goes to the throne. And now every single time the devil tries to go up to heaven, he loses. When he tried to devour the child, he loses. And now we see that he knows he only has a short amount of time to war against the woman and her other offspring. So we see that Satan loses, and we see that his time is limited, and we see that Christ is the one who is king, and he is going to rule forever. So no matter what your view is, no matter what you're going through, we can always have that affirmation of that Christ is going to be victorious. Just a couple more and then questions at the end there. And then the second one is Satan cannot accuse those who are covered by the blood of the Lamb. That is the victorious cry that those in heaven are saying when Satan is thrown out of heaven. Is he's wanting to accuse us. He's wanting to bring up every single sin we've ever had, or bring up our past, bring up our shortcomings. But what this text reminds us is if you are in Christ, you have nothing to fear, and the accuser has nothing to bring blame on you for, because we now in Christ are blameless. So in Christ we are covered by the Lamb, and so the King who is victorious now gives us his victory. And then the final thing is, even though we live on this earth and we may experience persecution that we see described through this book, we can understand that God is always present with his people, and he offers protection. Sometimes it may allow martyrdom, but he always will protect and preserve us, even if it might just be a spiritual sense. We know that we will be vindicated in the end. So we can see that Christ is king, that Satan is limited. We see that we're covered by the blood, that we can't have him accuse us any longer. And though there may be persecution, God is with us and he will protect us.